Thank you very much. I'm very honored to be here with you and to have the Asia Society host me. I hope that, my brief comments and then later our dialogue with my good friend Kevin is going to sort of be interesting to you. And in my comments, I won't be able to cover everything in the comments. So I'll try and concentrate on a few things, and I'm hoping that basically the later discussion with Kevin will allow us to cover many of the concerns that you have or interests that you want to hear about. I think the first thing from our country's perspective, the United Arab Emirates in the Middle East, is one of the things that actually take a lot of our time is the question of stability. For us, stability is important, essential. And I think also looking at what has happened over the last decade with the Arab Spring and with many, many critical, really, issues around the area, we look at that the area is more ready for an evolution rather than a revolution. So stability for us is a cornerstone. Everything we do in the UAE is with a view towards stability in the region, long-term stability, medium-term stability, because we feel from past experiences that in a region as diversified and at times intolerant and difficult as the one that we live in, the emphasis on stability is major. And we look at that and see that, when you have a major revolution such as the one we see in Syria, it really is a Pandora's box of contradictions that has led to the destruction and disaster that we have seen here. And with hindsight, we can come and say that regardless of the sort of issues that we confront, it is a much more rational way to work through an evolutionary process to look at stability as a major component of the necessary policies in the region. The second point I want to mention is the region also needs positive messages. It's a very turbulent region. And our Prime Minister, Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum, who's quite well known for being a doer, tweeted 2-3 weeks ago that the region has too many politicians and doesn't have enough people who are interested in doing things, in administering things, in running things. And this is a problem. So the UAE from that perspective is very much about a positive message. Many people from the region, from the Arab world and beyond, Iran, Pakistan, other areas, look at the UAE as a haven of stability. They look at it as a society that offers their family security, offers them opportunity, offers them what I would call a standard of living and a way of living that they see in other areas of the world. It offers them, not to over-exaggerate, normalcy, so to speak. And from that perspective, I think having a model such as the UAE, medium in size in comparison with many of the countries around, tolerant in its view, working in its institutions, is necessary in the region. And I think the more we spread that sort of positive example, the better it is for everybody. You don't want to be really an isolated island where things work and everything around you or most things around you don't work. So I think that is also a very important thing. I think the other issue, and I'm trying to go through some themes very quickly because I know that the latter discussion will be important because it'll pin, specific points of things that we want to discuss. I think the other thing that we've learned is the necessity of respecting diversity in the region. I mean, the Middle East is not all Arab, and the Middle East is not all Muslim. And I think they're realizing that the Middle East is a tapestry of different ethnicities, different religions, different backgrounds is necessary, because that is what makes the Middle East thrive. And if you look at the UAE, this is the sort of message we are trying to push forward. We celebrate, for example, when we discover the relics of a 1,000-year-old church in the UAE, because we think that this is also part of the fabric of what is the UAE today. We are also, we have huge Christian communities, Hindu communities living in the UAE, and we want them also to feel comfortable in the environment that they have chosen to live and work. So for us also the sort of, religious observance of their rituals, etc., is essential and important. And I think if you look at what has happened also in recent years in countries such as Syria and Iraq, because of the instability that I was talking about, you've seen, for example, age-old Christian communities having to flee, realizing that there is no future for them in the Middle East. They have to go to Europe, they have to go to America, they have to go beyond. And this is a very sad state of affairs of basically societies that these populations are an integral part of it. This is an indigenous part of the population of the region. So the UAE, in many things that it does, is very much a standard bearer of tolerance and diversity. I think the other 2-3 areas that I want to mention as headlines here is we have a tendency in looking at the problems of the Middle East and saying they're too complicated. And because they are too complicated, let's manage rather than solve these issues. And I think this has always been a problematic state of mind, because when you manage problems, it only creates another set of problems that are either related or not related. And in some cases, the sets of problems that appear are in many ways far serious than the original problem. And I think on the international scene, the UAE has been calling for several years now, is that when we look at many of the issues in the region, our approach should not be one of just managing the problem, but should be a little bit deeper as an international community here, should be deeper and should be targeted at resolving some of these problems. Case in point, for example, the Syrian crisis, because it went on and on and on, a sub-crisis was created, which was ISIS, which was a major traumatic, event, and that occurred because you allowed for chaos, you allowed for lawless areas, and you allowed for the area for a very terrorist radical group to recruit and mobilize and do this and that. The region also suffers from what I call a failure of diplomacy, where I would say zero-game believers in the region, unfortunately. It's I win, you lose. You win, I lose. And I think that approach really has been very problematic for us. And I think you see it in many current crises. I would say there is a failure of diplomacy currently in Yemen. There is a failure of diplomacy in Syria, clearly. And of course, we have seen also diplomacy unable to bring about what I would call a sustainable long-term solution to the Israeli-Palestinian also issue. So clearly, I would say that the approach in the region has always been that this is a zero-sum game. I will put my maximum demands, and you will put your maximum demands, and as a result, we'll fight it out until we all are so tired of it, and we realize that we should have done something about this a decade earlier or 2 decades earlier. And I think this is something that has been a consistent part of what we have seen and the legacy of the of the region. Now, having said that, and I'll stop here because we'll talk about Iran and we'll talk about Yemen and other things in the one-on-one with Kevin, and I'm sure this is something that I'll be asked also about. Having said that, we're also all concerned about the current nature of the international system. The current nature of the international system doesn't allow us to be secure in how we see things. I mean, we really are concerned, for example, about the sort of American role in the world. And we always look at the American role in the world as a positive thing from a perspective of a country that's always been friendly to America. And then again, we see the Russians coming back into the Middle East, for example. And the Russians perhaps are not a major global player, but in many issues in the region, they are a major determining factor in how things will go. And of course, again, you have Europe trying to sort of hold to vestiges of power and an emerging China. What we're really seeing is an international system that is very confusing, to be honest, that is not very clear, that's very fluid. And I think this also sort of adds to the current anxiety that we see. These are some of the sort of headlines that I wanted to sort of frame our discussion, and I hope now that we will discuss perhaps more details with Kevin. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, welcome, Minister, to the Asia Society.
Thank you, Kevin.
It's good to have you back.
Thank you, sir.
The Asia Society takes its definition of Asia as anywhere between Tel Aviv and Tokyo.
Okay.
So it is the UN definition. It's the wider Middle East, as well as the countries of South Asia, Central Asia, Southeast Asia, and East Asia. So we've always had a continuing interest in your region. I listened very carefully to what you just had to say. You had three things to say about your own country. It's normal. I tick normal. Normal is good in an abnormal world. It's tolerant, and tolerance is good in a world which shows less predisposition towards tolerance than in the past. And your attitude to the region is one of how do we solve problems?
Yes.
And I think you paraphrased your Prime Minister's tweet, too many politicians, not enough problem solvers or administrators or doers.
Yeah, exactly.
And then as you characterized the region and the wider world, it was for the region itself, one of its challenging attributes is the practice of a diplomacy of zero-sum game. I win, you lose. And then when you look at the wider global order, I think your concluding point was a global system which is not functioning as it's historically done and giving rise to fresh anxiety both within the region and beyond the region, and with now many more active external players. So apart from all that, it seems to be pretty good.
Apart from all that.
Let me just start with this.
Yeah.
I mean, you're an experienced diplomat, and one of the reasons I like you a lot is because you're a scholar. I mean, you're Georgetown, King's College, Cambridge. I'm an Oxford man, so I'll forgive you for that.
Okay.
But we all have our problems.
Yes.
Yours is Cambridge.
Including yours also.
But is your approach, let's call it the philosophy or the principles of the foreign policy of a small country, but a successful one, approaching the region and the world, inform our audience as to how you see the principles of the foreign policy and worldview of the UAE, including for the region?
Well, again, I think classically a small country would be part of an alliance and will be shielded by that alliance. That's classical. But I think what we are seeing also is the responsibility of countries in, as I said, a very fluid international system. So you have to also, part of our philosophy is you have, your relationship with your allies is a two-way street. You have to help, they will help you also. You can't be, it can't be a one-way street. And I think this is a conclusion that we came to a few years ago. So as a result, although we're a small country, following 9/11, we put our forces in Afghanistan. And we had forces in Afghanistan for over a decade. And we had a couple of reasons for doing that. Number one reason is to try and defeat the conception that many radical Islamists try to put across, that this was some sort of crusade. So clearly, if you are a Muslim country fighting against Al-Qaeda and Taliban in Afghanistan with the allies, this is something that tells you that this is not a clash of civilization. And this is quite popular at the time. I think the other thing also is this idea that you have to be capable of burden sharing. Burden sharing can no longer be just financial. You have a responsibility towards your allies to help them when they need help. And as a result, for example, we had about, over the 11 years that we were in Afghanistan, we had 20,000 of DOE armed forces who served in Afghanistan in several missions, in various missions. And we served in Kandahar, and we served in Bagram and other places. Part of that also we continued in our Balkans mission. And we played also part with NATO in the security and stability of the Balkans. And of course, the UAE has been a very active partner on the ground against extremism and terrorism. One of our, let's say, major pillars of our foreign policy is to refuse and do not accept the radicalization that is taking place within Islam, and to allow a small minority to try and hijack the religion and pretend that their radical narrative represents a wider Muslim world. How do you do that? You counter that by being part of these coalitions. You counter it by making sure that you are in the front line. And we've lost many of our young people in being in the front line. But I think this is a realization of a changing also international system. The sort of, bipolarity of the old, Cold War is over many years ago. And it is important that as you become, more responsible for your own security and for other concerns in the region, it is also extremely important that you bring value to the table. I think that's the first thing. The second thing, of course, is the UAE is a lot about investment and about trade and business. We are perhaps one of the most successful economies among the hydrocarbon or oil economies in our ability to diversify. So we've done that also by reaching out, making sure we are one of Australia's best trading partners, one of China's best trading partners, one of Brazil's best trading partners in the region. So really, if you look at the UAE's size, the UAE is not one of the largest countries in the region, but we have the third largest economy in the region. We're right after Turkey and Saudi Arabia. We, as an economy, we are larger than Iran. We are larger than Israel. We are larger than Egypt. And I think we've done all this because of this approach of diversifying. We spotted very early on the importance of what I call our logistics sector. So we put a lot of effort in ports and airports and airlines and free zones and so on and so forth. So I think our approach is twinfold. Number one is to seek more relationship that translates to mutual prosperity, and more importantly than that, to realize that this is a different world. This is a world where your allies count, but you have to also burden share and make sure that burden sharing is a major part of how you operate and work.
That's remarkable. I was unaware of the economic relativities within the wider region, and the third largest economy is something to be proud of. But your principles, as I understand them, are mutuality of alliance relationships, common burden sharing. I've certainly seen your troops in the field in Afghanistan. I've been through Kandahar many times when I was in office. Our own troops were in the province next door, in Oruzgan. And as you know, this was the violent end of the country. Secondly, effective global citizenship, your multilateral actions in countering violent extremism, as well as what you do immediately within the region. And thirdly, this remarkable economic success story, which, in my external perception, really leverages your ability as a diplomatic actor. You are not just a political state, you are a significant economic entity, and it works together. So when you take all those assets that you've got and you apply it to let's call it the hard question of the wider region, which is Iran. Give us your thoughts on how you would define Iran's grand strategy, if you like, and how you think the region is responding and whether it's doing so effectively.
Well, I think, the first thing I want to say is almost 4 decades of the Iranian revolution, you can't really say that the Iranian model is an attractive model in the region. It is really not a model that people will look up to and say, that's the way I want my country to be. And I think at the same time...
It's not popular in Sydney, I can tell you.
And I think at the same time also, as we are seeing nowadays, you have a much younger demographic with a lot of Iranians who would like to see their own country opening up, for their country being, let me say again, normal, not extraordinary, but normal in terms of, their ability to do business, to conduct their lives, to have stability and security in their country. Now, these are all internal Iranian issues. How they deal with them from our perspective is their business. But I think the problem that we've had and we continue to have with Iran is basically its external overreach. And that external overreach, in part of it is this ideological and sectarian messaging of the Iranian system and government. Iran has helped in its own way in raising sectarianism to become a major problem in the region. So rather than you looking at yourself as a national of a certain state, you're really looking at yourself from the perspective of a religious affiliation. And this has been very disastrous for the region. This has caused intolerance, because if you look at people from your own sort of religious perspective, you can't run countries and societies and the relations between countries and societies from that perspective. So I think that is a major problem.
The big Sunni-Shia split.
Sunni-Shia, and then of course when you get to Sunni-Shia, you get among also various smaller sects within the Muslim community, then about Christian communities that have been in the region for thousands of years, and so on and so forth. So clearly, looking at that, there is a real problem with Iran. Now, looking at the JCPOA, the JCPOA is a very problematic agreement from our perspective. The JCPOA was sold to us that it will actually ameliorate Iran's behavior in the region and will allow Iran to open up to the world and will allow Iran also to become a normal state. I mean, that was a premise that was there, part of how the JCPOA was sold to us. So clearly, 3 years from implementation, we see that we are nowhere near that. Iran has been much more aggressive in the region. Iran has been emboldened to export its missiles to the region, whether they are going to Hezbollah or whether they are going to the Houthis in Yemen. This has been a major problem, and I think Iran looked at the JCPOA and understood it to be partly nuclear agreement and partly acquiescence for it being the regional player. And as a result, we have been having issues and problems with Iran in the region through interference, rhetoric, all sorts of problems. And as somebody said, the problem sometimes is not in the nuclear technology itself. The problem is really in the beast that's controlling that nuclear technology. So the issue is not only the technology. The issue is also, the beast that is controlling that. And from that perspective, I think, we have been supportive of the current administration's withdrawal from the JCPOA. And we feel that sanctions and containment are an important element in bringing Iran back to the table to address three major issues. The first major issue is concerns about what happens after, the set timings in the JCPOA. The second issue is Iran's ballistic missile program. And we've seen that various instances where Iran is freely sending these missiles to Hezbollah, sending them to the Houthis, as I said. And the third issue is Iran's interference in regional affairs. Two examples are very clear about an emboldened Iran. Instances of exporting its missile technology and its physical missiles after the JCPOA. This is a sign of an emboldened country. And the other one, of course, is its very aggressive intervention in Syria. The escalation of Iranian intervention in Syria is also marked by signing the JCPOA, which clearly tells you that I have sort of, confirmed that my back is fine now with the 5+1, and I can go on with my plans for the region.
Problem on my left flank solved. Now I move on my right.
I move on my right. Yeah, that's how I see it.
Well, Iran is a formidable state, formidable history and civilizational state going back thousands of years. Yet, as I read their domestic politics, the domestic economy, they're under some considerable pressure. No. As you would see that, though, do you think this is going to play out in a direction which causes the Revolutionary Guard to double down and become even more hardline and more aggressive in the region? Or do you see the reverse possibility?
Well, again, I think the first thing is there are several, what I would call old states in the Middle East. Turkey is definitely an old state. Egypt is an old state. But I think Iran is basically a sectarian, ideological state. We have no problem, of course, with Iran as a state. We have a lot of respect for the culture and for the people there. But I think what is happening now, Iran is in a much more difficult position than it was when it signed the JCPOA in 2015. And the reason is its economy. I mean, the economy is run to the ground because of state management of all the major enterprises. The currency is suffering, and Iran is going into sort of confrontations that it doesn't have to go through. I mean, why would a country not concentrate on its own internal development? And you've seen many of the demonstrators in Iran who shout, enough of Gaza, enough of Syria, let's concentrate on Iran. So you clearly have a population that is saying to the government that please stop this investment in foreign expansion, and please concentrate on the economy, please concentrate on our lives. And this is a very powerful voice, because many of the demonstrations that we have seen recently are apolitical. These are demonstrations about people who are fed up with the collapsing standard of living. These are a population that, like anywhere in the world, that want to bring their kids up in a more diverse world, in a more plugged in and global world, want to travel, want to ensure their safety and security. And you hear many times on YouTube and other clips that come out of Iran of older women, younger women who come and say, all we want is a standard of living that rivals our neighbors in the Arab part of the Gulf. Because we've got the oil, we've got the culture, we've got everything that will actually allow for a successful society. Can we please live that? Can we actually have the comforts? Can we have the living standard that we want? And I think this is essential to understand. I mean, the regime is fighting an ideological battle rather than concentrating realistically on Iran's domestic program and so on and so forth. And while doing that, what does it really help Iran if which party wins in Syria, for example? But because they have been so fixated with the idea of an expansionist, sectarian, ideological policy, they are paying for it internally. And I think this is where Iran's Achilles heel is right now.
It's interesting if calculations have been made, and I'm sure you may know of some of them, of the actual cost to the Iranian state of the military operations in Syria and Yemen. For an economy, which you've reminded us before, is actually smaller than the UAE economy. As a proportion of budget, this must be a very significant proportion of budgetary allocations.
Huge, huge. I mean, the figure you hear with regards to Syria is anywhere between $5 and $6 billion a year. And these are $5-6 billion a year that, a lot that will be better spent in Iran on various, internal programs. And I think this is the problem also when a religious ideology runs a state. A religious ideology is messianic. A religious ideology, is not really that concerned with internal matters because it thinks that it has a higher call. And I think this is a major, major problem here. I understand that Iran wants to play an influential role in the region, but any state wants to have sort of influence in its region. But I would say that these have to be done through diplomatic and political and developmental means and economic means and investment. You can't do this through militia and consider yourself a normal state.
I'll be moving to questions of the audience the next 5 or 10 minutes. But just going back to our left flank, right flank analogy before. So you're looking at the region from Tehran. Let's move to their left flank first, which is Yemen.
Yeah.
How do you identify their strategy in Yemen and your own through the coalition's counter strategy? And I noticed this week you've been in discussions with the UN Special Envoy on Yemen. How did that go? Major issues, of course, humanitarian, political, security. Give us an overview of what you're up against, what's happening on the ground, and the people of Yemen.
Yeah. Again, I want to simplify this. I think there are 3 areas I want to mention: strategic, political, and humanitarian on Yemen. I think on the strategic angle, Iran has been very clever in building proxy militias. That's been very successful in Lebanon over 30 years. Actually. That's their software in Hezbollah. In Syria, Iran uses a lot of the militia, Hezbollah militia, and other Afghan militias and others that Iran actually is able to sort of organize and give them an ideology, etc. So clearly Iran saw an opening in Yemen with the Houthis. The Houthis are a small minority group that has over the years diverted towards Iran's sectarian view of Islam. And Iran saw that opening. And with the Houthi coup d'etat against the government of Yemen and taking over the control in Yemen, an Iranian government official said, this is a major shift, strategic shift in the region. We have now control over 4 Arab capitals. That's what he said. And clearly...
What year was that said?
That was in 2015. 2014.
Just after the takeover of Sana'a.
The start of takeover in Sana'a. So clearly, for us, on a strategic level, we, Yemen is, it's not exactly the same, but it's the Arab equivalent of Afghanistan. It's a very rough terrain, tough people, and has had also a very checkered history when it comes towards stability, etc. This time over, the issue in Yemen was different because you had an Iranian angle here. And we were not going to wait until a new Hezbollah was created. Again, I think everybody blinked in 1985 and allowed Hezbollah to build that massive force. And now, Hezbollah is a reality there with thousands of capable militias, with missiles, with influence, and so on and so forth. So clearly, we understood the challenge. The challenge was big, and to be honest, none of the wars in the region have been easy. Afghanistan hasn't been easy. Iraq hasn't been easy. Syria definitely is not easy, and Yemen is not easy. So clearly, to isolate Yemen and say the coalition is not doing well in Yemen, you're basically coming and saying, as if, the other wars in the region also were concluded very quickly and it was all done easily. Right now, as you mentioned, I had a meeting with Martin Griffith, and we are clear that the solution in Yemen is political. Everything that's happening on the ground in terms of military action is to try and change the calculus in order to facilitate a political solution. So really, our calculation is controlling the port of Hodeidah will tell the Houthis that this is their 11th hour and they need to reach a political solution. Now, our discussion with Martin Griffith was really about, after 6 months of trying to start a political process, the Houthi militias didn't come to Geneva. And suddenly, 6 months of hard work was down the drain. So our discussion really with him was about how do we revive the process? How do we bring the political process back? How do we get the guarantees that the Houthis will actually engage this coming time? Because the longer it takes, the more difficult it becomes in many ways. The view is this will need a process of discussion between the Yemenis themselves. Yemen is, like any country, is a very complicated country, and you cannot really resolve the issue. They have to resolve it. But the UN and the coalition will be there to, hold hands and support the process. Now, having said that, we have been, to be honest, clobbered on the humanitarian front. In many ways, we, like any crisis, there is some responsibility for the coalition. But I think at the same time, there is a tendency to blame the nation state, but not to blame the non-state actor. So in various reports, we see the nation states, the coalition in this case, taking 70% of the blame, and the non-state actor, in this case the Houthi militia, 30% of the blame. But clearly, we are also, the UAE has put over the last 2-3 years about $4 billion in humanitarian aid in Yemen. The Saudis have put more than that. But ultimately, you will be able to deal with these humanitarian issues piecemeal, but that's not the best way to go about it. The best way to go about it is through engaging in a political process, because only a political process will allow you to really address the humanitarian situation here. I have to say that, the sort of reputational damage has been big. And I have to say also that many of the criticisms that we have received Some are uncalled for. Some are...
This is the HRC report, or
No, I think in various things, in various things. But in reality, every war has had a humanitarian dimension. Afghanistan had a humanitarian dimension. Iraq had a humanitarian dimension. Syria definitely has a huge humanitarian dimension. But somehow, to come and say that we are going to be just hard on the coalition in Yemen, because they're the only ones who are doing this or doing that, it's not the whole story in my opinion. And we are definitely very sincere in pushing forward a political process. We all have to remember that the government of Yemen showed up in Geneva. The Houthis didn't show up. And I think people should take account of that.
The four states that presumably the Iranian minister was referring to was Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, and themselves.
And Baghdad.
That's right. Yeah. And so as we turn to questions, a quick thought on the right flank, which is Syria itself. Yeah. A subject which doesn't lend itself to a quick comment. No. Because it's a multi-dimensional mess, given the intersecting factors, geopolitical, ethnic, ideological, as well as sectarian. But it would seem, as from the external observation, that we see the regime of Bashar al-Assad, supported by the Russians, becoming stronger in its overall position. So how do you see this playing out for the rest of the year?
The regime is in a much better place than it used to be. There's no doubt about it. Having said that, Syria still needs a political process, because at the end of the day, you could sort of control more land, but you've also got to win back the people. You've got to win back the institutions. You've got to secure what you have in your what you're holding, and you can't secure it with Hezbollah militias and Iranian militias. So political process is important. So number one is a political process. If you look at it, the Russians are key to Syria, and we try to differentiate between their role and Iran. The Russians want to convert their military success in Syria to political outcome. The Iranians want to stay there. They want to have a front line with Israel. They want to have control over what happens in Syria. They want to have an open corridor with Hezbollah. They want to do all that. So the Iranians are there to stay. And I think this is dangerous. The other important element from an Arab point of view, where we see it very problematic when a major crisis, the Syrian crisis, which is an Arab crisis, is being discussed by 3 non-Arab states. Yeah. So basically it's Russia, Turkey, and Iran, who are basically the drivers right now on what's happening in Syria. Having said that, not all these efforts are successful. And I bring you a point here. I mean, in January, it was agreed that they, with Russian influence, etc., it was agreed that they will start with a constitutional committee that will draw a constitution. We are now in September. 9 months later, this hasn't happened. So clearly also, the Russians also are seeing it very difficult to push forward a political agenda in Syria. So clearly for us, as we work now in Syria, we've got several priorities. Number one is to work more and more on Russia and to understand that the Russian position in Syria is different than the Iranian position. And the Russian can actually be constructive. We need to work with it on trying to bring about a political solution. I think the second thing is to try also to bring, the Arab sort of offices back on the scene, because we have really been absent on Syria for the last 3 or 4 or 5 years, I would say. I think the third thing also comes then the issue of refugees. Now, there are studies that basically say that once a refugee, the average is that you will be a refugee for 17 years. And clearly that means that many people who had left Syria in 2011 and 2012 are now refugees 6 years later. So for us also, I think as we work on a political solution, there has to be the guarantees to the refugees coming back. And currently what we are seeing is that refugees are more secure, the trickle that goes back are more secure in areas that are controlled by the Russians than in areas that are controlled by the regime or by Iran. And I think for these people to come, I mean, these are destitute people. They've really lost everything.
Yeah.
They are, and many of them have no future really in any of the countries around Syria. So for them to come back, we do really need to give them the guarantees about their property, about their lives, about their kids, about their future. And I think this is an essential part. You can't, let this, this flow of refugees go back to a jungle, of insecurity and so on and so forth. And I think that's essential.
I'll come back to that as we close up a bit later on. Now, questions from the floor. Please indicate if you have any questions for the Minister. One thing that I would, we have some coming in, which is on a different subject altogether, which I must admit I'd neglected to raise with you. Qatar.
Yeah.
Desired outcome for the UAE to end what the question, this is an online question, by the way, from someone who's viewing, to end what they describe as the diplomatic unpleasantness.
Yeah. That's very diplomatic.
It's very diplomatic. And so where are we up to with Qatar? And do you see any solution anytime soon?
No, I think Qatar, last year, the Qatar issue, there were a few people who thought that it was important and relevant. Right now, I don't really hear anything about it. I think we've said all we have to say, which is basically there are concerns that are raised by Qatar's neighbors with regards to Qatar's support for jihadism and for many of the more radical elements in political Islam. Once Qatar addresses these concerns, then I think there will be a route for reconciliation. But I don't really see much interest in this issue right now.
The global and regional temperature on the Qatar question seems to have come down a lot.
Yeah, it's come down.
As I observe it.
Come down. I would come and, if I was advising them, I would say save your money because there's no interest in the issue.
So the diplomatic unpleasantness is probably, to use the question's term, going to remain unreported, unpleasant, and probably increasingly unreported.
Yeah, unreported.
Let me, I'm happy to take questions for those who are interested, but I wanted to probe one thing further because it comes out of your last point, and that is back to Syria and let's call it the Iranian-Hezbollah corridor, as they would seek. Obviously, I've been up to the Finger of Galilee. I have seen the Hezbollah flag just across the side. As you said, that's been there for quite a long time. Now, of course, the prospect the same as in the Golan and not far beyond that. So the tripwire now in terms of a major conflagration with Israel would strike me as much sharper than it's been because of these developments. We've seen recently that tripwire flipped in the case of Russia with the downing of a Russian aircraft through complex miscommunications on the ground and shielding of aircraft and all the rest of it. But it strikes me that we are now getting to a more dangerous threshold because of the direct interest of Israel being affected. So your thoughts on, shall I say, this fresh tripwire possibly triggering an even broader conflict in the region?
Well, I think, at heart is not Hezbollah. At heart is really Iran.
Yeah.
Hezbollah, at the end of the day, is a proxy of Iran. If Iran shuts down its finance of Hezbollah, within 2-3 years, Hezbollah which will be a much more diminished militia in many areas. Iran puts, by some accounts, about $1 billion on Hezbollah in terms of various things that Hezbollah does. Some are social programs, some is military training, etc., etc. And I think the idea, or to think that Hezbollah actually has an independent policy is quite a falsehood. Hezbollah is a tool of Iranian policy. So what does Iran really want to do? I think blinded by ideology, Iran is not concentrating on building its own economy and providing for an expanding population, younger expanding population. So the whole measure of Iranian success, you measure your success firstly by what you do in your economy and what you do in your society. And then foreign policy is the third measure of your success, or the fourth, if you put in other things such as technology, etc. I think here we have a loop-sided view of how things are, because there is no success to show economically and there is no success to show socially. The whole emphasis is on the messaging of the Islamic Republic of success in the foreign policy. So the idea that we are influential in influencing the creation of the new Iraqi cabinet, in a way it gives you grandiose ideas of how important and successful you are, even though your population is, screaming about their next meal or tomorrow's meal. And I think this is a major issue. Having said that, I think Iran has built a presence with Hezbollah and is quite influential player in Iraq and wants to also link these two through Syria. So clearly they have invested money, they have invested blood, they've invested political capital in Syria, and they have no intention of leaving in Syria. And this is why they are part and parcel of this mentality that there will be a military victory in Syria. There are only two more steps for Assad to regain Syria through military conquest. So with this approach, what Iran is thinking is, we want to be in Syria, we want to create a militia in Syria, we want to be an influencer in Syria, and ultimately also you create an asset in Syria similar to Hezbollah. Maybe today we don't have to be contiguous to the Golan. We don't have to be contiguous to Israel because the Russians are there. So we are going to watch the 140-kilometer periphery between us and the Golan and between us and Israel. But the Russians are not going to be there forever. So maybe what we can't do now, we will do in 3 or 5 years' time. It's always been the long view and the patience here. Now, unfortunately, I find this policy, number one, destabilizing in the region. But number two also is problematic also for a normal nation state such as Iran, which should really put a lot of its assets back in reviving its economy, creating opportunity, etc. We really want to come to a day where we deal with a normal Iran, where we're able to go and travel and be tourists there and invest and have business and go and see all the wonderful sites that they have, cultural sites that they have. But the problem is we're not seeing that day, because right now this is a regime that only measures its success in terms of its political expansion, because it doesn't really have anything else to show.
In fact, as you described before, the domestic constraints within Iran, which is a population becoming increasingly dissatisfied with the misallocation of resources to external adventurism. It's interesting emerging parallels even with a much larger economy, the Russian Federation, where you begin to see domestic protest activity over the cost of let's call it the Syrian operation on behalf of the Russian armed forces, which has now gone on for a long time. Yeah. The last question, and then
and the Iranian cost is much higher because they've got, in relative terms, because they've got thousands. They are the foot soldiers, really.
Yeah.
They are the foot soldiers in what's going on.
So as I close out,
you have a question there, I think, from the lady.
Oh, I'm sorry.
In the green.
Hi. I would like you to tell us a little bit what the state of what was called the Qatar diplomatic crisis with Saudi Arabia and some other countries.
Yeah, I just answered, but I'll say it again. Okay, I think this is more and more as an issue is less relevant, because it's like basically both parties have said what's on their mind. So what is on our mind basically is that our main concern about Qatar has been its support for radicalism, jihadism. It's really been, the sort of checkbook policy for jihadism and radicalism and so on and so forth. And we have said, that this is a major issue for us. The idea that we have a member of our club being at the same time the financier of many of these radical groups such as al-Nusra in Syria, or the Muslim Brotherhood or Hamas or others. This is problematic for us. But the problem, of course, the Qataris are insisting on this, and we're saying, we either go our separate ways, which is what we're doing right now, or you have to address these concerns, because today you cannot be part of what is essentially a status quo, conservative region, and be at the same time the financier of radicalism in the Arab world. I don't see much interest nowadays in the issue, to be honest. You have to get some, you really have to pay a lot of PR firms to start getting one op-ed out, and next year it'll be less important. And I really, call on them to save their money on this and just address the concerns of the region.
Well, thank you. I'm conscious of the time. We're already about 15 minutes over. So thank you so much, Minister, for being with us here today.
Thank you.
And for what I think has been quite a remarkable tour d'horizon of UAE, Iran, and frankly, the principal domains of regional, shall we say, crisis at the moment, both in Yemen and in Syria. Now, you're a Cambridge man, you said before. What did you like particularly about Cambridge when you were there?
It was more exclusive than Oxford.
In the diplomatic classics, that's regarded as touché, to which I'd say that's why there are many more Australians at Cambridge than there are at Oxford. Anwar, thank you so much for being with us. It's been fun.
Thank you.